And I am live. Hello everyone, can you all hear me? I'm just wondering because I had the music on there for a moment, and just to kind of get people in. By the way, I'd like to know if that's effective, because I've of course gone and planned out what I'm going to talk about. Whoops-a-daisy. Okay, so how's everyone doing? We've planned this all out. So I've got it like on the background with the audio, so it kind of took me by surprise there. So I'm assuming that I can be heard. So, as a first thing to say, for those who aren't aware, I have started a Bitchute channel on the recommendation of a comment. Now, I don't expect to be using this all that much because frankly I don't think I'm important enough for YouTube to stamp me out. And I also don't think I'm edgy enough. But I'm going to have it there just as a backstop. So if YouTube takes me out, for whatever reason, I have something there to rely on. Because it's conceivable that it will happen. And that's what this stream is largely going to be about. A mixture of people on the traditional end of things being taken out by media companies that do not like traditional ideas. We're also going to be talking about bureaucracies that don't like us and such things as this in order to understand how we can counteract that. Because I hear a lot of people complaining and talking about how horrible it is. No, I haven't set up the auto-upload system, Constantine. I've heard a lot of people complaining about this problem. How, my free speech is being stamped out or whatever, which are, legitimate complaints. However, that doesn't solve the problem. That doesn't solve the problem. By the way, Afiz, if you didn't know, that's Kyrie eleison, the introduction there. So I thought I'd talk about that a bit. And also, how we can solve this, but also, in order to properly understand potential solutions to this problem, we need to have a understanding of where we're at right now. So before we can even talk about potential solutions to this problem, there needs to be an idea of what the problem is in of itself, and also an explanation of what sort of assumptions that we're going to be taking here. Because if one of those assumptions from my part is off, and I'm probably not going to mention all of them because I'm not aware of all of them, but if one is off, then my entire potential solution could be very wrong. And we need to know that before we proceed. Like I say, I'm a bit tired of hearing people saying, "Oh, I got taken off of YouTube, I got taken off of Twitter, I got taken off of these social media sites," and they're not really doing anything about it except being a loud and clanging cymbal. In fact, this is one of the reasons why I got more out of politics, because I heard a lot of people who are incredibly good at talking, but weren't very good at doing. So, I think we have sufficient people here to sort of go over what the situation we are facing is right now. And I don't mean just me. Because with YouTube, yeah, that's very clear. But you also have to worry about yourselves as well, because you have jobs. I'm sure that at least one of you watching has a family, in spite of our age. And you don't think that they're going to go for you as well? Do you think that the cancel culture has any kind of worries about going after awful targets? Targets that are, out of the way? Do you think that laying low will necessarily save you? I don't think it will. I think that if you're going to try and do the lay it low kind of thing, that's a very big roll of the dice, and you may not roll the correct number. So, although you may not know it, you have as much of a stake in this as I do as a content creator. Because it's the same mob that's going to be going for your job, for your family, etc. And so that's why I think this will be beneficial to everyone. So, going into the situation that we're facing right now, and I'm going to name some of the positives as well as the negatives. We have, first of all, a lynch mob mentality that's going on at the moment. Some people on the libertarian right call it a moral panic or whatever. Some of us call it a new religious movement, a new religion. Sorry, I'm twisting my tongue. A new religious movement. So, I think it was the Great Awakening that I've heard it called. Either way, we're facing some sort of panic against anybody with a traditional mindset. Yeah, as Jojo mentions, they defiled a statue of our Blessed Mother in Boston. I think they also did one in the UK as well. Either way, we're facing a group of people who are incredibly hate-filled. All it takes is an angry mob of one of these groups to cancel you entirely. That is to, well, this depends on your employer, to throw you out of your job and to make you a persona non grata. Likewise, even in places where this kind of woke culture isn't dominant, there is a very strong culture of detraction and straight up calumny and gossip. We look at the woke mobs, we look at these, I suppose to use an old term, the SJWs, and we say they're the extreme part of the culture. No, because, you see, the thing is that there is a large contingent, particularly of the professional classes, I'm thinking middle, and upper middle classes, who are intent on playing this corporate game of who can stitch each other up hardest, because it benefits them in terms of power. These people aren't the blind ideologues that run through the streets tearing down statues. These are people who are a lot more Machiavellian than that. And so it's not just these radicals that are running around and scaring people and pressuring corporate boardrooms into putting up, crazy stuff. You also have a large contingent of people who are so ruthless and so utterly dulled to the sense of the human person that they will detract and calumniate you with anything that they can in order to get ahead in the corporate boardroom or in any business. And believe it or not, it's a lot more present than it once was. A lot of the time before, although this of course happened, it was tempered by a recognition of the divine origin of man. So you still of course had crazy political battles, the Wars of the Roses, the Italian Wars and stuff, and you had all of this kind of drama as well, but it wasn't to the same cutthroat intent because people were still Christian. And I think these are the people that are potentially the greater problem, because they could just throw you to the mob if they wanted. The mob itself, I think it's losing friends very, very quickly. Now, the great thing, and the one advantage, or maybe not the one advantage, but the one saving grace that we have in this respect is that the only way that you're really going to suffer is if your employer cares, or you work for yourself. You see, they can't fire you from a job that you control, be it through the assent of your employer or through you owning the whole business. And all they can do is really yell at you over social media. Now, there may be in some strange cases instances where they will come to your house and perhaps cause a nuisance or whatever, but I think those are very rare. And I suspect that the kind of audience that I have aren't going to be the kinds of people that are living in major cities. I don't know, though, for certain. Why do Christians care about the statue of Mary? Isn't that idolatry? No, it's not. It's called hyperdulia in the case of Mary, the most high veneration of Mary. It's not worship. And the statues themselves, of course, aren't Mary, so we don't worship the statue itself. It's an aid. Now, the second thing that we have to face, as you can see, I'm just answering questions as we go along, is the toxic environments that we find not only in the currently existing institutions, so, for example, the corporations, just generally speaking, the government, even middle and lower level businesses generally, is that they're quite toxic. As has been the case through a lot of human history, but of course to a greater extent now. Like a lot of the problems we have now have always been present. They're just far, far more powerful by virtue of the cross not being present, is that ego is everywhere and omnipresent. And, of course, with ego, you can cause all kinds of problems. Remember, the first sin ever was Satan disobeying God out of pride. And almost everyone, and I include Catholics, trads, and myself in this, are far too arrogant. We are far too full of the not the rich man's disdain, the prideful's disdain, and the rich man's scorn as a society. And so you have to be very, very careful around certain people. Likewise, a huge number of people run institutions without knowing the roots of their organisation. Now, this isn't so much of an issue with the corporations themselves, although, as you'll often learn when you read business books, that when the founders leave and some random Ivy League or Russell Group graduate business major or honours degree holder takes over, the thing will often collapse into the ground because there's not the same understanding of how everything works intuitively. And this is even more the case with the legal system. I'm gonna go out here on a limb and say that a very large proportion of lawyers in the Anglosphere don't believe the principles that first established the system. And so when they set in place new laws, and when they enforce existing laws, then they're going to enforce them in a way that is incorrect. Or they're going to present laws that contradict the legal system, which makes it very weak. Because people can perceive these contradictions, and it of course damages the perceived justice that comes from the legal system. Apropos to this, you have a lot of people who are in minor positions of power, such as lawyers, HR managers, also just general managers, who are very resentful, first of all and primarily, and second of all, they are ideological, in the sense that we've described. It's usually these middle, and upper middle class people who hold this revolutionary ideology that we are seeing tearing apart American cities at the moment. When you're poor, you don't really care so much about these sorts of things. When you're very, very rich, you tend to know better. And so, in a very direct way, all of us are under the threat of middle management. But we can make our own. We don't have to associate with these sorts of people if we don't have to, if we're willing to make sacrifices. Now, of course, if we're going to make sacrifices, we have to consider two things. First of all, the economic state of our countries, and second of all, the educational position of our countries. Now, let's start with the economic positions. We have a massive wealth disparity in our countries. I believe I was reading something along the lines of America having an average wealth per household of $680,000 and the average debt being $340,000 or something like that. Now, the trouble with averages is that you miss the massive deviation, the massive standard, I think it's standard deviation. You have 80% of people or something below the median wage. And then you've got a gigantic number of people well above it. Now, as someone like Margaret Thatcher would argue, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people on the bottom are poor, which in many cases they are. But what it does mean is that there is one group that has inordinately more power than another. At least in our perceptions. People are also increasingly employed rather than self-employed. People will go and work for a corporation or they'll work for a shop rather than trying to make their own businesses as our grandfathers once did. I can't recall them from memory, but if you go and look at the comparative employment numbers in 1900 versus the ones now, and compare self-employed to employed under a boss, you'll find that a lot more people are working under bosses right now. And one of the things that often isn't talked about is the massive devastation economically that has led to this disparity. And it isn't just free market stuff like the left will talk about. It isn't just massive amounts of regulations causing people to be unable to set up businesses at a lower level, although that is true, like the right talks about. No. One of the largest things that causes people to be poor is family breakdown and sexually degenerate lifestyles. Because, as Aristotle said, the foundation of any society is not the individual, it is the family. Because an individual cannot self-replicate, but a family can. And as we've seen huge numbers of divorces, we see increasingly loose views of the word marriage, extending sometimes to a plurality of people and even to animals. We see the net economic impacts. In fact, this was a phenomena that the USSR had to respond to in the 1920s. Now, I'm not going to mention this on stream, but you can go and look into the sorts of laws that specifically Joseph Stalin, I believe it was Joseph Stalin, put in place to stop this destruction of the economic base of the Soviet Union. Because specifically the social policies of Lenin were disastrous. I mean, of course, war communism was as well, and the NEP somewhat changed that. But there were other factors as well that people aren't really comfortable talking about. And finally, before we discuss solutions, we have the problem of education. I think it's pretty safe to say at this point that education in the humanities is objectively abysmal. Now, that doesn't mean that good work isn't being produced by these sectors. For example, there is a reason, I increasingly realise now, there's a reason why Michel Foucault is cited so much. And it's not just because he is the dominant state philosopher right now, it's because some of his ideas are quite important. Although I still very much vociferously disagree with his viewpoints on most things. It's important to understand that. However, as you will realise when you debate almost anyone who's gone through one of these humanities courses, even on their particular subject, you will often be able to outwit them quite quickly, particularly if they hold the standard view, because the universities don't really require much of you. Likewise, we also have very little in the way of practical skill about in people. There's at least in the middle class at the very least, right? Even as somebody who has finished a degree in computer science and can program quite well, I find it quite troubling that I don't know as much as my mother or my grandfather do about, say, the local wildlife, the local plants, how to install certain things, how to, basic home repair, home maintenance and stuff like that. I mean, I can learn it in a pinch, but I don't have it on mind. And I'm someone who would want to have it on mind. A lot of people don't even want that. However, on the bright side with these 2 points, we have the greatest access to human customers. And I do mean human, because money is just a symbol. It's like, how do I put this? I didn't expect to be saying this, so I'll put it briefly. Money doesn't actually have inherent value in and of itself. It represents the material wealth of a society. At least it does in our system, especially under fiat. So, human customers buying, as opposed to machines buying. I mean, machines are automating for humans is one thing, but, if you have exchange of goods between people, then that produces an economic subsystem. When you have exchanges of debt or exchanges of meaningless stocks between bots, then that doesn't really produce value. But now we have a huge amount of access to customers to sell. Likewise, we have the greatest technology sector in human history. The fact that you are all tuning in from around the world, the United States, from Canada, from Germany, from Vietnam, from Japan maybe, from Russia, from France, from South Africa, and from Brazil. This is something that would have been inconceivable 150 years ago. But we have that now. So, there are bright sides to this. There are a lot of problems, and I have no doubt that I haven't listed all of them, because this was basically just a mind map that I put together in 5 minutes. And I'd very much appreciate if you could mention other things that I haven't acknowledged in the chat down there, because as we go forward with this, because I've got a proposed solution or a collection of proposed solutions, which I'm sure many of you can guess, it will be important to acknowledge these, because it's one thing for us to point out problems. The right wing and the left wing and just YouTube in general is very, very good at that. You can hear the shouting of problems from the rooftops. It's a loud cacophony, and sometimes they tear down statues in response, sometimes they don't. But you hear the continual utterance of problems from every single quarter. But the problem is that so few people are willing to do anything about it beyond tear things down. It's very easy to motivate someone to tear down a statue, but to build something, to take the institutions that we have and perhaps improve them or build new ones, as I propose, that takes effort. And YouTube and just people on YouTube in general don't seem to be quite so up to that as they are at listening to different podcasts. Now, I'm not assuming this about anyone, of course. It's just an observation that I've made. So bearing that in mind, let's discuss solutions. Now, the first solution is that we need to get our own lives in order. And this is ultimately what's going to found the new institutions. It always starts with the boring stuff. First of all, pray. Because you can't do anything without God's will, be it actively or permissively. You need that, and you need perfection. And part of that perfection is easing yourself off of bad habits, and to step away from giving those people that control those bad habits money, because those bad habits are bad by virtue of the fact that they're immoral. And do you want to be giving your money either through ads or directly for things that fund bad habits? Or would you rather spend that money on something else? Would you rather, forfeit your subscription on Pornhub.com? Or would you rather spend that money on something else? Would you rather be addicted to cigarettes? Or would you rather spend that on something else, something more productive? One of the best principles I've ever heard, and I'm going to modify this somewhat, is from Luke Smith, who's a tech YouTuber. And he says, he uses this heuristic for his life. If it makes you more independent, then it's probably worth taking. And if it's something that makes you more dependent on the system, which it will be a little bit different in the way we work through this on the stream, then it's a bad thing. You want to be as self-sufficient as possible. And not just because the system itself is seemingly running on steam, but also because if somebody decides to cancel you from that system, then you aren't going to completely bottom out, either mentally, physically, psychologically, economically. So if you have no bad habits, or you're working on those bad habits to stamp them out, there is less that you're going to need to rely on the state for, or the companies for. Now, on top of this, I'm going to talk about a principle from the famous Catholic historian and economist even, and just generally really entertaining writer Hilaire Belloc. And he believed, under distributism, which was a derivative framework from Catholic social teaching, that the means of production should be in the hands of as many people as possible. At the time, you had the means of production being controlled by very few. This was at the beginning of the 20th century. You had factory bosses, industrialists, and such controlling the majority of the industry and production in any given country. And on the other hand, you had the socialists who believed in common ownership, which would mean, at least in the short term, the possession of these things by the state. Of course, people like Lenin would argue that the state would melt away and some paradise would somehow come about. But this obviously hasn't happened. Belloc decided to take kind of a halfway house, wherein the means of production would not be as centralised as under a typical capitalist system, but at the same time they wouldn't be owned by the state. So you'd have a civilization and a country of artisans. People who produced things and sold them and kept small holdings. Cooperatives came out of this specific idea. And this is what I think that we need to adapt. I think there needs to be artisanship. And for all of you here, I think it would be something that would grow you as a man and also counteract the problem of not being educated in practical skills. And that would be to take up a craft and start a small hustle off of it. So, to sell things. For example, how many of you have wanted to brew beer? The Trappists do this, and they fund their monasteries with it. How many of you wanted to make butter? How many of you have wanted to raise animals for meat and for eggs and milk? How many of you have wanted to make jam? How many of you have wanted to craft rosaries? There's nothing stopping you do the very last one right now, because you can go to Etsy. Now, the other things have regulations around them. Of course, you can't, at least in Britain, you can't slaughter animals outside of an abattoir. If you slaughter them yourselves, only you can eat them. But, if you have that power, then you're distancing yourself from the state, and you're also developing a useful skill for the future. If you have the ability to raise pigs or chickens on your own and slaughter them, and then you and your family can eat them, then that's one skill that you have over the institutions that are currently dominating society, and it makes you less reliant on them. Another thing that I think that people could do is start making their own YouTube channels and writing their own books. Now, the Catholic sphere is pretty good for the production of books and media, but it's still good to have more voices involved, so the cream rises to the top and the cream is better. Like I say on this list, this will be important because it produces a supplemental income. You will need this at some point, because if we're going to end up in a Great Depression, which it's looking like we are, it will be good to have extra money coming in, because you won't completely lose heart, first of all, and second of all, you'll still be able to pay all your bills. And so I think that it's important to start learning that skill now. Now, some of us, particularly the people in engineering, we already have extremely monetarily valuable skills in our own right. Like myself, I'm a computer science graduate, and I'm going into graduate school as well. A lot of you aren't. A lot of you have degrees in various humanities, which are useful in some sense, but they don't have the same direct applicability. And so I'd recommend you go and learn a skill like that. But specifically for the engineers in the audience, or for scientists and such, people who have to play around with that kind of thing, we can do something very, very useful for these particular people, and that is to produce infrastructure. Because the thing that the crazy people have, the people tearing down statues, the thing they have is that they have an extremely sophisticated and powerful infrastructure that is quite hidden from what I can tell. We don't. The trouble with anybody traditional, the trouble with traditional groups in general, is that they're very sporadic, very individual, on account of pride, and so they don't have infrastructure. Now, I came up with a couple of projects that people could work on to build this up, and indeed the Muslim communities have built some of these. Now, the first one I've written down here is to start building means of communications off of the main sites. Now, I've already done that through riot.renaissancemen.xyz, which you can find in the description. I've already produced an independent means of communicating, so that you don't have to rely on the social media giants to communicate and coordinate things. I already did that. Another thing that I might work on is a directory for Catholic businesses, specifically Catholic businesses, so that when money is spent, it is kept within the community and within this economic subsystem, which is not. It's going to be a lot harder for that system to cave under pressure to people who want to represent ideas that are anathema to our faith. Thirdly, and this is a much more difficult thing that I know that I can't do, we need to start producing our own payment processors and maybe even our own banks. Now, this has been done in the past. I don't know anything about the regulation behind these particular things, but I know that it may get to a point where we might need these. Muslims have already done this. Muslims already have Islamic banks in this country. I don't know what is involved in setting up a bank, and I'm not even going to try this because I don't know. But I think that it would be beneficial to have somewhere where our money isn't going to fail us and where people who have set up businesses know they can store their money safely, and a place where they can accept payments. Because that doesn't currently exist. A lot of people get cancelled by payment processors and by banks when they become politically unpopular. And I don't think it's a good idea to put your fate in their hands. Now, we might not profess the same, frankly, disgusting ideas that those sorts of people often do, but we cannot rely on that kind of thing. We don't know what they think of as socially acceptable and unacceptable. However, there's no sense going any lower level than this. I don't think we'll ever reach a point where we have to worry about our ISPs and about the Cat6 cable, in our wall, or our Wi-Fi providers. I don't think we'll have to worry about that, because worst comes to the worst, you just go down to the coffee shop and you just continue using it there. One thing that I think would be a really cool thing for people to do, if there's any software engineers in the audience, would be to make our own top-level domain. That would be pretty cool. But finally, and to something that I think more people can relate to, there needs to be a very, very focused push in every single one of us to discern our vocations. Most of us will end up married and with children. Some of us are meant to be priests. Some of us are meant to be monks. But all of them are important, not only in a spiritual sense, which is ultimately the whole reason behind this, although I haven't mentioned it now, not only in the spiritual sense, because it's what God intends for us, but in an economic sense as well. Because as we've said, families are the root of society. And the monasteries and the priesthood provide hierarchy for not only for morality, but also centres of production as well. The monasteries built Europe. So this needs to be discerned with fear and trembling as well. This needs to be done. One of the key things that every single person should do, whether they're going to be a father, a mother, a nun, a brother, or a priest, is they need to know their scriptures and the tradition very well. Because nowadays they don't teach it. Now, in this particular economic podcast, I am specifically thinking of two writings that I've come across, and that is St. Benedict's Rule and St. Gregory the Great's Pastoral Rule. And these lay out two very important things. Firstly, St. Benedict's Rule gives you an idea of the sorts of things you need to be thinking of when you're planning a basic unit of economy, be it a monastery or be it a family. How are you going to pray? How are you going to handle goods? How are you going to handle guests? He really goes through the nuts and bolts. And Gregory the Great is a similar thing for priests, but it's a lot more emphasis on what constitutes a good priest, and how to handle things like preaching and such. Now, these largely won't be directly useful to you, because these were written in the 6th century. I believe both of these were written in the 6th century. But they do provide a good idea of what sort of things you should be thinking about. Because if St. Benedict and St. Gregory thought they were important, they would have written them down. Now, there are other things you can read as well. The Rule of St. Augustine, the Dominican Constitution would be another one. And there are all manner of different books on organisation and bureaucracy that come from that era that are in the Catholic tradition that we can rely on to help structure our families and structure any sorts of institutions that we can build in response to this. But it's important that they actually get read. We need this. Because it's all well and good for people to make YouTube channels where they talk about the faith. That's needed. It's important. It's a good thing, but there needs to be much more of a focus on building up actual brick and mortar institutions. Now, of course, people like the distributists have talked about this. I've talked about it at length for at least a couple of years, but I don't see anything being done. And so I'm setting about doing it myself, because if no one else is going to do it, I might as well. And I've of course made a start with riot.renaissancemen.xyz, and there's going to be more stuff added to that site in good time. Okay, that's the main talk. If you guys have questions, because I'm going to be doing a Q&A in just a second, please stick them in the chat and tag me. I'll be scrolling up again through the chat and reading through the Riot as well for questions. If you want to leave questions, please do so. I will be back momentarily. So let's see what questions we have. From the Riot server, we have a question. On the topic of payment processors, Wirecard went bankrupt a few weeks ago, which handles a lot of credit cards. I didn't know that, but I do think it's important to have these services here so you can't get cancelled off of them. It's all well and good maybe getting Stripe and then PayPal and then maybe Bitcoin together, but first of all, most people don't use Bitcoins. And second of all, Stripe and PayPal, you've just handed your power over to two companies and they could cancel you simultaneously. You want a group of people or a product that isn't going to do that. But let's go over to the chat. Yeah, it's loud. That's the good thing. That's what I kind of want. So I've got a super chat for £5 from Sinbel Extra Tempus. Why is eating pork non-circumcision and such okay, but sodomy isn't? How does the new covenant work, and how do you pick these rules? So there are generally two, sometimes three divisions in the Old Covenant. There's the moral law, which is the Ten Commandments, and then you have the ceremonial law, which are the things like mixing fabrics and things like that. You also have the implied rules throughout Genesis and such, which are basically just commentary on the, or maybe not commentary, but implicit explanation of the Ten Commandments. Now, we hold the moral law, we hold the Ten Commandments, and we hold to all of the stuff that was related to that. However, the ceremonial law, those things surrounding the different offerings you see in the Old Testament, things like mixing fabrics, eating pork and such, we don't hold to them because these were put in place after the rebellion of Israel at various times throughout the desert, and Christ trampled that down, first of all. But that doesn't mean that they're entirely dismissed, because they have what is called typological significance. Why would God decide to ban something so obscure as, say, hyena meat? Because hyena meat is explicitly banned in the Old Testament. Why would he do things with shellfish and such? It's because these things represent different negative behaviours. So, for example, with hyena meat, this is the one that always sticks in my mind, because the Epistle of Barnabas explains this in more detail. But the banning of hyena meat is because hyenas have this strange thing where I think it's the females will have both male and female genitalia, and the male genitalia is fake. And therefore, to eat of the meat of the hyena is to imply that you eat of the flesh of a liar. So that is why that particular thing is abolished. But you have a number of different writings that you can rely on for that. I suspect that... I don't know for certain, but I reckon that there's a huge number of medieval writings on this particular replacement. I reckon that specifically Origen, who was writing in the second century and 3rd century, actually I think it's 3rd century, would have a lot of this in his homilies on parts of the Old Testament. Like, you can find his homilies on Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Joshua, and I suspect that he goes into a level of detail on this. But the one that I've read myself for definite that has a lot of detail on this would be the Epistle of Barnabas. Right, okay. Can you list these books on the Riot server, please? So many good recommendations. Sure, I'll stick them in the voice to text chat right now. Pastoral Rule of St. Gregory and St. Benedict's Rule. Those are the main ones I was talking about on stream. They're the really important ones. Let's scroll up before I see the other questions. Lawyers here in Austria are the most right-wing area in the university. There are even quite a few. Yeah, I know of certain edgy political activists who come from that particular area of faculties in Austria. Also, France has this weird thing where there's these intensely left-wing universities, but also intensely right-wing ones as well, where you get the Nouveau Droit from. Owning your own business isn't always surefire. Just remember that the baker out of Colorado. Yeah, but you do it in such a way that because if you really want to, you can just produce the sorts of things that those kinds of people are not interested in. And I don't mean the people specifically involved in that incident. I mean those sorts of people that would kick up a massive fuss over something like that. For example, I doubt they're going to be really interested in rosaries. Let's see. There's been a number of things. Comments about Foucault. Does this include fantasy fiction? Yeah, I mean, if you want to sell fantasy fiction, then, you know, if it brings in money, that's great. Yeah, I know that the intermission. I know that the chant is very loud. I was told to keep it very loud. My vote. How would it be possible to work a typical 9 to 5 job and do something like farming on the side to support your family? Well, originally the 5-day work week was split up so that on Saturday you could work on your own things, and then on Sunday you'd have it for the Lord. So you'd have it on Saturdays, I think. Do you think that we should start investing not only in the nuclear family but extended families in order to do something like this? Yes, I do, but I don't think most of us have the kind of network to do this. I know that I don't. Of course I have extended family, but it's not quite so strong. Being from a Protestant background, the Protestant extended families don't tend to be quite so strong as the Catholic ones generally are. Not to mention the fact that we've gone through 2 generations of just gigantic social decay. Right. Felix mentions, many of these things cannot be done alone, so you need a good network of other Catholics who would be willing to do something like this. How do we build those networks? Well, a start would be my Riot server. If you want to talk to people on there, you're more than free to organise stuff on there. Aside from that, like, you see, I've been thinking of getting into contact with other Catholic YouTubers because, in case you haven't noticed, I'm kind of an island here. Although I have talked to other Catholic YouTubers at some length. I remember streaming with Return to Tradition, for example, Anthony Stein, once. I didn't really keep in contact with him because that was on an old channel. I've talked to Classical Theist at length a number of times. Who else? I've been on the Daily Brap. I talk to those guys quite a bit. You see, the thing is that I did establish very briefly a Twitter account again to get into contact with people, but I was driven away by how toxic Twitter is generally, and that would be a good place to build connections if you want to lose the quietude of your soul. But I'm not the kind of person who can resist that, because I'm a very argumentative kind of person. So I end up going onto Twitter, I'll find some sort of progressive, and I'll spend the next 3 hours, I wouldn't say dunking on them, but narrowing them more and more into a corner over a particular point. To the point where they'll often make themselves look very ridiculous, but the problem is that this winds me up in the process. Thank you for explaining the Old versus New Testament. Okay, great. That's no problem. What exactly are patristics? I keep hearing about people taking it up. So, patristics are the Christian writings. I'm getting this from a particular book by an Italian-American author whose name is completely slipping my mind. He wrote one of these introductions to the Fathers. The patristics are Christian writings from the 2nd century, or the late 1st century, through to the 8th century. The first father is generally recognised as Pope St. Clement I, and the very last one is generally recognised as St. John of Damascus. And these are essentially footnotes on the scriptures. They're explanations of the scriptures. They are arguments on particular Christological things, church structure. Basically, they're the scholarly foundation of the Christian faith. Before, say, the scholastics came along and the Orthodox went and did their own thing with Hezekiah and Palimism. They're very, very important, and there are a lot of introduction books on them. I've been listening through one, but I haven't picked it up in the last few days. I'll check my Audible to see the particular title, because there's a bunch of them about. One of them would be The Fathers Know Best, which I haven't read, but I've heard good things about. The one that I'm listening through at the moment is When the Church Was Young, Voices of the Early Fathers, which will give you very short introductions and very short explanations of the really important fathers. Now, there are tons of them, hundreds of them. For example, Aquinas produced a patristic commentary on the 4 Gospels where he cited 80 of them in different volumes called the Catena Aurea, which I mentioned on other streams. They are incredibly important, and the thing with them is that they aren't this kind of high-minded philosophy like, say, Thomistic philosophers of mathematics. They are often very straightforward and very practically important. They're very applicable writers. For example, Chrysostom, when he talks about marriage, is a really good example of this. Was Edward III justified? I'm trying to remember which one. Edward III, yeah, the King of England, Edward III. I don't know why. I mean, I know who you mean. I assume you mean. Well, Edward II was murdered by having a red hot poker shoved into his nether regions. Edward I invaded England. Edward III invaded France. You see, I need to really brush up on my medieval history. When it came to what happened in the south of France under the Black Prince, I think it was, who was his son, the complete ramsack of southern France. No, he wasn't. He went way too far. As for inheritance of the French crown, I don't know. There were 2 different sides of the Capet family, I believe. Capetian dynasty. The Plantagenets and... was it the Valois? I can't remember specifically. Hans Hermann Hopper asks, does writing books on theology/philosophy count as a skill you can invest your talents into, even if you're a layman? I think that there are a lot of... okay, this is something that I didn't mention earlier on, but I think that the right wing has, or at least... I mean, yeah, the right wing and pretty much all internet people in the modern age have the same problem as they mock leftists for, in that you'll see these memes where they say, okay, they've already chosen the commune poet. Now, that's not to say that you can't do philosophy and be very successful at it, but it has a very, very high, a very high you have to put a lot of time into it. I'm trying to figure out what the correct ratio would be. A very high commitment to, production ratio, right? You can commit a lot of time to philosophy and make no money at all. But if you are one of the 2 or 3 really successful people, you can make a ton of money. I don't think it's a really good investment. That's why, aside from my YouTube, I do something that is immediately practical to most people, and that is software engineering and computer science. So, I mean, you can do that. Would it contribute? Yeah, you could make something really, really good, but don't count on it. Have you considered reaching out to Matt Fradd? I bet he'd be a great resource as a fellow content creator. I don't think he'd want much to do with me, because he's a very... Not because... You see, we're very, very different characters, Matt Fradd and I. He seems like a very melancholic character, a very well-meaning, very, very polite man, very nice guy. And I'm not. I am the exact opposite. I am somebody who is incredibly choleric. I'm someone who, when someone comes out with something, I don't suffer fools, I think my priest put it. I really don't. I don't really care much for appealing to the social sensibilities of, someone who thinks that they're smarter than me, first of all. And second of all, to somebody who does not have a good intention. I will go for the jugular if I think that I can. And I would not do this with Matt Fradd, obviously. I love the guy. But I think that the way that I come across in conversation would make any sort of communications between the two of us not especially productive. But I don't know for certain. I don't really have the perspective on life to really say that. Secondly, I don't really know what he'd ask me. I don't really know anything that he doesn't or he could get someone better on for. Do you think that a reunion with some of the Orthodox churches is possible within our lifetime? Yes. I heard that the Greeks are at least open to the idea along with the Copts. Yeah, in fact, one of the real problems between Mount Athos and the Ecumenical Patriarch in, I'm going to call it Constantinople because it is that the Ecumenical Patriarch is very keen on a reunion with Rome, but a lot of the Athenites really aren't. And there's been all kinds of drama in those sorts of areas, right? Like this isn't pie in the sky online rad trad stuff. This is a lot more present in the Orthodox world. Not to mention the schism that already has gone on very recently. In fact, a lot of people forget this, but the Orthodox rad trads have almost got more of a leg up than the Catholic ones in at least official movements. For example, I don't speak for all of the old calendarists in this, but the old calendarists who reacted against the changing of the calendar to a revised Julian calendar in Greece had massive popular support. Like thousands of them came out against this new calendar. Whereas I don't think that the TLM, SSPX / Sede types really have the same public enthusiastic support as, say, the old calendarists. The strange thing about a lot of Orthodox writings, even the really, I don't know if I'd call this a mainstream writing, but even writings that are more friendly to the average person, like the Evergetinos, talk about the toll houses very openly as well, and that's one of the tenets of the more traditionalist Eastern Orthodox people. It seems a lot more open. The rad trad part of Eastern Orthodoxy seems a lot more present in their mainstream than it does in ours, because it's very, very easy to ignore the extremes of, well, Catholic tradism in the grand scheme of Catholicism, because Catholicism is huge. It's not quite the same with the Orthodox. Edward III was accepting Alfred, the greatest English monarch. Edward III was the chivalry nerd, began the 100 Years' War. I thought so. Yeah, because the Black Prince, of course, he won the Battle of, well, I don't know if the Black Princes specifically, but the Battle of Poitiers and Crécy. Alfred the Great is actually a local saint, by the way. I know somebody who was confirmed under him. For those who are interested. A lot of stuff here from Totus to us. By the way, keep the questions coming in, guys. We're going to go for another 5. Let's see. Highly recommend Introduction to the Devout Life by Francis de Sales from Magnus de Ret. Yeah, I've heard really good things about it as well. Yeah, we never got taught that song in school, Totus. We had, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Okay. Let's see if there's any questions I missed. Oh, Cath socks. Cath socks in the UK, because I've seen this mentioned a few times. Yeah, I've heard very mixed things, because mine... I don't know how much detail I should go into it. Mine went from being very, very, very traditional, and I mean almost overly traditional, to very, 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 or maybe not very, 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 but like quite liberal, pretty much overnight. And I can tell you for a fact, I was one of the more liberal people in the more trad types. It might be very hard to believe, but I was one of the more liberal people. Now, to the best of my understanding, I am probably the most... Well, actually, there's a couple of people who might be more down the trad pipeline than I am, but it's a lot more liberal than it once was. As for generally in Cath socks, I've heard that they're generally very traditional, with a couple of exceptions. Thoughts on the Assassin's Creed new game? I don't know. I don't play Assassin's Creed. Anyway, so I think we're going to bring this to a close. Now tomorrow we're going to be talking about the men's rights movement, feminism, and a new approach. Because I think that, first of all, I think this could get the attention of some of the people who came from Coach Red Pill, and perhaps give them a new lease on life, because they tend to be quite bittered against women, because there's this massive distrust between men and women that needs to be fixed. And also, I think that it could lead to some responses from people in the MRM, the men's rights movement. I'll probably change it to just the manosphere. But that is going to be the aim for tomorrow's stream. So anyway, thanks very much everyone for watching. I tell you what, Hans Hermann Hopper, stick that on the Riot server and I'll answer it tomorrow. See you later, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.